In this hypothetical hearing room scenario, the line that sliced through the noise wasn't a shout or a slur. It was a calm question, delivered like a legal brief. Congresswoman Omar, Vance says, steady as a metronome, you've built a public brand around speaking for the overlooked and the underpaid. So when did you decide to look like the thing you say you're fighting? The room is full in the way rooms get full, when everyone suspects the day will end with somebody's name stapled to a headline. Cameras are rolling. Staffers are pretending not to text. And the witness table feels less like furniture and more like a spotlight. Omar shifts in her chair as if she's trying to find an angle where the questions can't reach her. Vance doesn't frame it as culture war theater, and that's what makes it uncomfortable. He says the subject isn't identity, faith, or origin, and he repeats it like he's setting a boundary for the record. He says it's about paperwork, money trails, and a scandal that, at least in this dramatized telling, has produced a long list of indictments and a bigger list of rumors. He describes a program meant to feed kids during a crisis, and he describes money that allegedly went everywhere except where it was supposed to go. Then he pauses and lets the room sit with the ugliest part. If the allegations are real, the harm isn't abstract. It's children and families and taxpayers who did nothing wrong. Omar launches into the defense she's practiced, the one that turns scrutiny into a story about prejudice and double standards. It's not that those pressures don't exist in the real world. It's that, in this scene, the defense is deployed like a shield before anyone's even swung. She builds momentum, voice rising, finding the familiar cadence of outrage that plays well on television. Vance doesn't interrupt, doesn't scoff, doesn't roll his eyes. He just watches, like a prosecutor letting a witness talk themselves into a corner. Then he lifts a single sheet of paper, and the temperature drops. He says he has names, dozens of them, all tied, according to this fictionalized record, to federal charges in a major fraud case. He says several of those people also appear in campaign donation records, not as loose change, but as meaningful checks. He points to one name in particular, and he doesn't call the person a monster. He calls the connection curious, which is courtroom code for, please don't insult the jury's intelligence. He mentions witnesses who describe the individual as someone who leaned on community members during elections, a fixer type, a pressure guy, and he lets that hang. Omar's hands fold together, not in prayer, not in calm, but in that involuntary way people do when they realize the script changed. Vance says he's not asking her to answer for every criminal act in her orbit. He says he's asking whether she's comfortable with the pattern, the same circle showing up in scandal paperwork and in campaign finance reports. He paints a simple image of the ordinary taxpayer, the person who pays into public systems and assumes, maybe naively, that the money will at least attempt to reach its stated purpose. He adds a detail about a restaurant, presented here as a community hub and a political hangout, and he suggests the optics are messy, even if the truth is still being argued in courtrooms. And he asks, in plain language, whether she ever questioned why the same names kept appearing near her events and near the alleged fraud. Omar says she had no knowledge of wrongdoing, the classic line that sits somewhere between plausible and impossible depending on what comes next. Vance doesn't call her a liar. He asks about timing, because timing is where innocent stories often stumble. He says donations were returned, but he notes they were returned after raids, after headlines, after the world already knew the story existed. He asks the question that makes every politician's throat go dry. Why wasn't the money returned before law enforcement forced the issue into daylight? And then he narrows it down to one binary. Did the named individual work with her campaign in any capacity, yes or no? She tries to widen the frame with generalities about community support, which is like answering, "What time is it?" by explaining the concept of clocks. Vance repeats the question with the patience of someone who knows the cameras will make the silence louder than any words. The room waits, because everyone understands that yes creates a connection and no creates a potential contradiction with other testimony. After a long pause, she gives a thin yes, and it lands like a dropped glass. Vance nods like he's checking a box, not celebrating, because in this style of confrontation, the win is the record. He summarizes the point without fireworks. An indicted figure helped raise money, and the campaign benefited from that participation. He asks whether she ever wondered how people who weren't known as wealthy players suddenly became generous, consistent donors. He brings it back to the intended beneficiaries of the program: kids, families, schools, and he asks whether her public moral language left any room for basic due diligence. Omar tries to say she was deceived, and Vance doesn't accept or reject it. He asks what steps she took to avoid being deceived again. Then he pulls out a letter she wrote calling for investigations and notes. Again, that the date makes it look reactive rather than proactive. In this dramatized hearing, the room doesn't explode, it fractures. You see aides whispering, reporters typing, allies staring straight ahead, as if eye contact could be subpoenaed. The story leans into the symbolism of staffers leaving, because every walkout reads like a small act of political triage. Whether those exits reflect panic, strategy, or coincidence is beside the point. The image is what viewers remember. And Vance, still calm, says that was only the first set of questions. Then he changes gears in a way that sounds almost polite, which is a dangerous tone when the subject is money. He says, essentially, that love is a beautiful thing, and the line lands with a faint ripple of uneasy laughter, because everyone senses the sarcasm without it being spoken. He introduces the relationship timeline with a consultant, a vendor, a campaign firm, and he describes how personal and professional lines can blur fast in politics. He claims the campaign paid the firm millions over time, and he lets the numbers sit in the air because large numbers don't need adjectives. Omar stiffens, and her attorney leans in, because this is the part where "it was legal" often becomes the whole defense. Vance brings up a state campaign finance review and says that officials found violations, though not the kind that come with dramatic handcuffs in the hallway. He emphasizes bureaucracy, not conspiracy, as if to say the paperwork police aren't known for their flair, but they do know how to count. He notes a fine, a reimbursement order, and he treats it as a signal flare rather than the main event. Then he moves to federal oversight and clarifies something that gets muddled in public debate. A deadlock is not the same thing as a clean bill of health. He doesn't accuse, he implies, and implication is sometimes more corrosive because it invites the audience to complete the thought themselves. He paints the donor's point of view, because that's where political morality either holds or collapses. A small donor gives $10 or $25 not because it changes the world, but because it's a pledge of trust. If that pledge is routed into a vendor relationship that looks personal, the donor feels played even if everything was technically within the rules. Vance asks what services justified the scale of payments and whether comparable work on other campaigns typically costs that much. Omar says the relationship had nothing to do with campaign decisions, and the room hears the words, but watches the math. In this scene, Vance doesn't call it a romance funded by donors. He asks whether donors would describe it that way if they knew the timeline. He asks whether campaign contributors were ever told, in plain language, that a romantic partner was also a major paid vendor. He makes a small joke about how most people's courtship involves dinner and flowers, not consulting invoices, and it earns a tight laugh from exactly nobody who matters. Then he returns to the point. Even if it's legal, is it ethical? And if it's ethical, why does it feel like a story campaigns usually try to bury? Omar doesn't answer cleanly because clean answers are rare when the facts feel sticky. Next, he widens the lens to business ventures connected to the same circle. He references lawsuits and investor complaints as part of the public record, being careful, at least in this rewrite, to keep it in the category of disputes rather than proven crimes. He describes people who thought they were investing in ordinary ventures and later claimed they were left holding losses they didn't expect. He cites bank balances that look absurdly small compared to the amounts allegedly raised, which creates the kind of "wait, what?" moment that viewers remember. And he asks Omar whether she was aware of these disputes while campaign payments continued to flow. She tries to separate her official role from her spouse's private projects, which is a normal instinct and sometimes a fair argument. Vance counters by asking a simpler question. When your public identity is watchdog, what's your standard for looking away? He doesn't say she orchestrated anything. He asks whether she asked any questions at all once lawsuits became public. He frames it as competence rather than villainy, because incompetence is easier to prove and often just as damaging politically. And that's the trap. If you deny knowledge, you look negligent. If you admit knowledge, you look indifferent. Then he pivots to the "some people did something" controversy, and he treats it like a character test. He says he understands civil liberties debates and acknowledges that communities faced backlash after national trauma. But he asks why her language seemed to minimize the scale of what happened, and he reads the quote slowly, letting the phrasing do the damage. He references the families who felt insulted, and the way the phrase became a permanent symbol in public argument. Omar tries to argue context, and Vance insists he's read the context, which is what people say when they want you to stop using context as an escape hatch. In this rewritten version, he avoids calling her evil and avoids turning the exchange into a religious accusation. He keeps it about rhetoric and empathy and basic respect for mourning, because those are safer lines of critique and harder to deflect. He asks whether she can name victims, not as a trivia contest, but as a way to demonstrate she holds the human reality, not just the political framing. The silence, again, does the work, and the room feels that shift from argument to judgment. And the story uses that moment to show how quickly a narrative can flip when the public decides you don't sound connected to their grief. Finally, he circles back to wealth and the optics of anti-elite messaging from someone living comfortably. He does not allege hidden crimes in this rewrite. He asks about the broad question that always follows politics. Does the lifestyle match the rhetoric? He references financial disclosures in general terms, the way commentators do when they want to raise eyebrows without stepping into a factual claim they can't prove. He asks whether being a millionaire, while preaching against millionaires, creates credibility issues, even if everything was earned and reported properly. Omar is forced into the same tight corridor. Deny the label and look evasive, admit it and look hypocritical. As the hearing ends in this dramatized arc, Vance stacks his papers like a man who believes presentation is part of persuasion. He doesn't declare guilt, he declares questions, and he repeats the phrase, "What did you know and when did you know it?" Because it's a classic for a reason. The media reaction, as written here, is less about facts being proven and more about political damage being done. Allies speak carefully, critics speak loudly, and everyone starts calculating distance like it's a matter of self-preservation. And the audience at home is left with the same uncomfortable feeling the room had. Even unanswered questions can change a career. What comes next in this narrative is the broader commentary about political hypocrisy, donor trust, and the gap between speeches and systems. But the key is to keep it grounded in questions, records, and visible contradictions, not in definitive claims of criminality that the story can't prove on its own. If the point is accountability, then the language has to model accountability too, including the possibility that some facts are disputed, and otherwise it becomes exactly what it accuses others of being, a performance designed to produce a feeling rather than a conclusion. And once the audience senses that, they stop listening, no matter how dramatic the music gets. Vance doesn't end it with a gavel slam or a victory lap. He ends it with a ledger of unanswered basics. He looks down at his notes, then back up, and says the same thing 3 different ways, so nobody can pretend they misheard him. If your public brand is accountability, he says, then accountability starts with what you checked, what you didn't, and why. He reminds the room that he's not asking for slogans, and he's not asking for speeches. He's asking for timelines and decisions. Then he narrows it to the only thing that matters in a hearing like this. Who did you vet, and when? Omar tries to reclaim the emotional ground again, arguing that her work speaks for itself and that political attacks are predictable. Vance doesn't take the bait, because bait is where witnesses hide, and he keeps his voice at the same volume. He says nobody's on trial for having a cause, and nobody's being interrogated for being persuasive. He says the question is simpler. When the stakes involve public money and public trust, did she treat oversight as an obligation or an inconvenience? And he asks it one last time, slow enough for the cameras. Did you ever ask where the sudden generosity was coming from? He then turns slightly toward the committee, like he's handing the problem to the adults in the room. He asks whether the committee is comfortable normalizing a standard where connections are explained away as community, and timing is explained away as coincidence. He asks whether "I didn't know" is acceptable as a blanket response when warning signs were allegedly visible to anyone who wasn't trying to avoid seeing them. And he frames it as a bipartisan problem, because cynicism grows when voters think the rules change based on who's in the chair. That's how trust dies, he says, not with one scandal, but with 1,000 little exemptions. The next exchange is deliberately procedural, which is what makes it more damaging than a shouting match. Vance requests specific documents, specific dates, specific communications, and he does it like a checklist, not like a speech. Omar's counsel objects in the careful language lawyers use when they're trying to slow momentum without looking like they're hiding the ball. Vance accepts the objection, then asks for the same information through a different door. Then provide what you can provide, and explain what you can't, and why. It's a trap made of courtesy, because refusing a polite request reads worse than resisting an accusation. He circles back to the vendor relationship, not to moralize romance, but to underline transparency. He asks whether donors were ever clearly told, in plain English, that a major paid vendor was also a close personal relationship. He asks whether any internal controls existed to prevent conflicts, or whether the campaign treated the entire question as a public relations problem. Omar insists the work was legitimate, and Vance responds with a question that sounds almost boring until you think about it. Who priced it? Because if nobody priced it independently, then legitimate becomes a word with no spine. He moves again to the lawsuits and disputes around the business ventures, staying careful in the wording. He doesn't declare outcomes. He points to what has been filed, what has been alleged, what remains contested, and what the public can verify. Then he asks the only ethical question that survives every legal hedge. Did you keep paying while you knew people were claiming they'd been harmed? Omar tries to keep the wall between her office and her household, and Vance says he understands the instinct. But he asks whether her voters are supposed to believe she can regulate others, while she refuses to apply curiosity inside her own circle. At that point, the room isn't watching for a confession anymore. It's watching for competence. People don't need her to be perfect, but they want to see that she has a baseline method for preventing disasters around her. If she can't describe that method, then her moral language starts to feel like branding rather than leadership. Vance doesn't say that directly. He lets the silence do it, because silence is the one thing nobody can filibuster. Then he gives her an opening that sounds generous and is actually brutal. Explain what you would do differently, step by step. That question forces a choice. If she gives a real answer, she admits the old approach was insufficient, which validates the scrutiny. If she gives a vague answer, she confirms the criticism that she lives in slogans when the moment demands structure. So she tries a third path, saying she supports reforms and stronger oversight in general, the kind of sentence that fills time but solves nothing. Vance nods once, then asks, "Great. Name the reforms you personally pushed before this became public." Now the hearing has a rhythm, and everyone in the room feels it. Claim, question, pause. Generalities, follow up, pause. The pattern isn't theatrical, it's administrative, and that's why it sticks to the skin. Because administrative questions don't care about charisma, and cameras love moments where charisma fails to unlock the door. Vance keeps his tone calm enough that any discomfort looks self-inflicted. He ends this segment by telling the chair he's done for now. He doesn't ask for punishment, he asks for clarity, and he puts the burden back on the institution. If the public can't tell the difference between oversight and optics, he says, we're going to keep repeating this. Then he looks at Omar and says, almost softly, that this is the job. You don't get credit for caring if you don't do the boring work that caring requires. And he sits back, because the most effective pressure in a room like that is letting the record speak, while the witness runs out of room to hide. The chair calls a short recess, the kind that pretends to be routine but feels like oxygen being pumped into a room that's running low. Staffers lean in, whispering strategies that sound confident, until you notice how often they repeat the same phrases. Reporters rush the hallway, not because they have answers, but because they sense the shape of a story changing. When the gavel brings everyone back, the room feels smaller, like the walls edged closer during the break. Vance returns to his seat without theatrics, the posture of someone who believes patience is leverage. He starts again, not with a new accusation, but with a recap, which is often more dangerous. He summarizes the timeline as it exists on paper, not as it feels in speeches, and he does it slowly. Dates, filings, donations, reimbursements, reviews, public statements, all lined up like dots waiting to be connected or convincingly separated. He says the committee doesn't need conclusions yet. It needs coherence, and he asks whether coherence is something Omar can offer today. Omar responds by emphasizing process, pointing to staff, advisors, compliance teams, the invisible machinery campaigns claim exists for moments like this. Vance nods, acknowledging that campaigns are complex and responsibility is often shared. Then he asks the question that cuts through delegation. Where did accountability stop and plausible deniability begin? He frames it as a management issue, not a moral one, which makes it harder to dismiss as political theater. If you're the principal, he says, you don't get to outsource curiosity. He asks about internal controls again, but this time he's more specific. Who reviewed donor lists when large sums came in clusters? Who flagged vendors whose compensation grew faster than campaign output? Who raised concerns, and what happened to those concerns when they were raised? Omar answers with generalities, and the room hears the gap between what's said and what's described. The questioning drifts toward a broader issue that makes incumbents nervous: normalization. Vance asks whether the committee is comfortable with a political culture where every irregularity is excused as an oversight until it's undeniable. He asks whether voters are expected to accept "I didn't know" as a complete defense in an era where information is supposed to be instantaneous. He says cynicism doesn't come from one scandal, it comes from patterns that never quite get addressed. And he wonders aloud how many such patterns the public has been asked to swallow. Omar tries to pivot to her legislative work, listing bills, hearings, statements, the visible output of an active office. Vance doesn't dispute the workload. He questions the alignment. He asks whether a platform built on rooting out abuse should have a higher threshold for tolerance when warning signs appear nearby. He asks whether moral authority is strengthened or weakened when scrutiny is framed as persecution. The room grows quiet again, because this isn't about her opponents anymore. It's about expectations she set for herself. A committee member interjects, suggesting the tone risks becoming adversarial. Vance agrees, almost eagerly, and says adversarial hearings are easy and mostly useless. He says this is administrative, not adversarial, and that administration is where trust either gets built or lost. He repeats that nobody is declaring guilt today, but that unanswered questions have a way of becoming permanent. And he says the committee owes the public more than vibes and assurances. The focus returns to donors, not as villains, but as people who made choices based on trust. Vance asks whether any donors have reached out asking for explanations, and what those explanations were. Omar says she's spoken to supporters who expressed concern, and that she reassured them. Vance asks what reassurance looks like when the facts are still unsettled. He wonders whether reassurance without disclosure is comfort or avoidance. He brings up the refunds again, careful to describe them as corrective actions rather than confessions. He asks why refunds weren't standardized policy whenever risk appeared, instead of reactive gestures after exposure. He asks whether future campaigns will adopt stricter rules or whether this was an isolated lesson. Omar says lessons have been learned, a phrase that sounds responsible until someone asks which ones. Vance asks her to list them, one by one, and to say when they were implemented. The answers trail off into abstraction, and the chair intervenes to keep time. But time, as everyone knows, isn't the real constraint. Clarity is. Vance uses what's left of his slot to ask a final series of either-or questions. Either oversight was insufficient, or warning signs were ignored. Either donors were misled, or transparency was inadequate. He doesn't force her to choose. He lets the options sit side by side. The effect is subtle, but unmistakable. Viewers at home start choosing for themselves. And once the audience starts completing the argument, the speaker loses control of the narrative. Omar insists she acted in good faith, which is a claim that can be sincere and still incomplete. Good faith, Vance replies, doesn't replace good process. As the hearing moves toward its end, the mood is no longer explosive, just heavy. No one is cheering, no one is shouting, and that's worse for the witness. Because anger can be dismissed as partisanship, but disappointment sticks. Vance thanks Omar for appearing, and the thanks sound formal rather than conciliatory. He says the committee will continue reviewing materials, which is bureaucratic language for "this isn't over." Outside the room, the interpretation wars begin immediately. Some commentators frame the exchange as a hit job, a calculated attempt to wound a progressive figure. Others frame it as overdue scrutiny, long delayed by political caution. Most viewers land somewhere in between, unsure what to believe but certain something felt off. And uncertainty in politics is often deadlier than opposition. Omar's allies emphasize the absence of definitive findings, reminding audiences that questions are not verdicts. Critics emphasize the accumulation of questions, arguing that volume alone suggests smoke. The truth, as usual, sits in an uncomfortable middle, where nuance struggles to survive. What can be said is that the hearing didn't resolve anything. It reframed everything. It shifted the conversation from intent to execution, from identity to administration. In the days that follow, attention drifts to secondary characters. Former staffers speak anonymously, offering impressions rather than evidence. Donors release statements that say very little while implying a great deal. Advocacy groups call for transparency without naming specific remedies. Everyone positions themselves for the next chapter, whatever it turns out to be. Omar gives interviews that stress resilience and commitment. She talks about being tested and staying focused on her mission. But interviewers keep circling back to the same topics because narratives don't move until facts do. Each appearance is less about persuasion and more about damage control. And damage control, by definition, assumes damage exists. Vance, for his part, doesn't tour cable news victory laps. He appears sparingly, reiterating that oversight is not persecution. He says hearings are meant to clarify, not to crown heroes or villains. His restraint frustrates some supporters and reassures others. It reinforces the image he cultivated in the room: methodical, not theatrical. Within the party, quiet calculations continue. Leadership watches polling, not headlines, because polling tells you when doubt becomes durable. Fundraisers listen for hesitation in donor calls because hesitation signals risk. Potential challengers take notes because opportunity often follows uncertainty. No one says it out loud, but everyone feels the shift. The broader conversation turns philosophical, as these things often do. What does accountability mean in a media environment built for speed? Can movements scale without building internal brakes? Is moral urgency an excuse to skip operational discipline, or a reason to demand more of it? Those questions outlive any single hearing. Some younger activists express frustration, not with scrutiny, but with preparedness. They argue that if leaders claim to represent them, those leaders should anticipate hostile questioning. They don't want perfection. They want competence under pressure. The hearing becomes a cautionary tale shared in organizing spaces. Not, "Don't be bold," but, "Don't be unready." Others dismiss the entire episode as political noise, destined to fade. They point out that scandals come and go, and attention spans are short. They're not wrong about the cycle, but cycles leave residue. Even forgotten controversies shape reputations in subtle ways. Trust, once bent, doesn't fully snap back. As weeks pass, investigations grind on quietly. Paperwork is requested, deadlines set, extensions granted. Nothing dramatic happens, which is how most consequential things happen. The absence of spectacle frustrates viewers who want closure. But closure is a luxury institutions rarely provide. What remains is the impression of a leader under a harsher light. Not condemned, not cleared, but scrutinized in a way she hadn't been before. Every future statement about accountability carries extra weight. Every call to trust demands evidence that didn't feel necessary before. And that's the lasting impact of moments like this. The hearing becomes a reference point, a remember when, that surfaces in debates. Supporters say remember when scrutiny was weaponized. Critics say remember when answers were thin. Both sides use it as shorthand, which is how narratives harden, and hardened narratives don't require fresh facts to persist. In the end, the story doesn't resolve into a verdict or a redemption. It resolves into tension, which is more honest and more uncomfortable. A tension between ideals and administration, between rhetoric and routine, between the promise of change and the discipline required to deliver it. That tension follows Omar into every subsequent appearance, whether she acknowledges it or not. It follows the party into internal discussions about vetting and messaging. It follows voters who want to believe but don't want to be fooled. And it follows the broader system that produced the moment in the first place. Because systems don't change when individuals stumble. They change when expectations do. By the time the room finally empties, there's no sense of triumph anywhere, just residue, the kind that sticks to the carpet and the air vents and follows people out into the hallway. Staffers exchange looks that say more than their words ever could, and reporters pack up, knowing the real story won't be written tonight. It will be written in follow-ups, in footnotes, in the slow drip of documents and silence. And in politics, silence is never neutral. What the hearing leaves behind isn't proof, and it isn't absolution either. It's a shift in gravity, a feeling that the ground under a once stable narrative has softened. Questions that used to be brushed aside now feel reasonable, even necessary. Defenses that once sounded righteous now sound incomplete. And the audience, both in the room and far beyond it, senses the difference. For Omar, the task ahead isn't to win an argument, because arguments end and perceptions don't. It's to decide whether transparency is something to be managed or something to be embraced. Whether accountability is a slogan deployed against others or a standard applied inward. Those choices don't get made at microphones. They get made quietly, often too quietly for cameras. But voters, once alerted, have a way of noticing what doesn't happen as much as what does. For the party watching all this unfold, the moment serves as an uncomfortable mirror. Not because one figure stumbled, but because the system allowed confidence to substitute for clarity. Movements thrive on belief, but institutions survive on discipline. When the two drift too far apart, the correction is rarely gentle. It arrives as scrutiny, as doubt, as a recalibration no press release can fully reverse. And for Vance, the role he played is less about ideology than method. He didn't need to declare victory because his approach wasn't designed for applause. It was designed to expose gaps and let others decide what those gaps mean. That kind of pressure doesn't fade when the cameras shut off. It lingers because it feels procedural rather than personal. In the end, the hearing doesn't answer the biggest questions it raises. It doesn't declare guilt or innocence, heroes or villains. Instead, it reframes what leadership is supposed to look like when the stakes involve public trust. It reminds everyone that passion can open doors, but preparation determines what happens after. And it leaves a final, nagging thought hanging in the air, long after the chairs are stacked and the lights dim. If accountability is the promise, then scrutiny is the price. If power is the privilege, then clarity is the obligation. And if a political career is built on asking hard questions of others, it should survive those questions when they finally turn inward. That's not cynicism, it's governance. And whether the system is ready to live up to that standard remains the only question that really matters.